Food in Australia at our supermarkets, typically they have about 10 days of dry food, 7 days of fresh. We find that our chemists might have about 5 to 7 days of medicines. Our hospitals have about 3 days of medicine. So it's not just about whether or not you can go and pick up the kids in the car. If we do have serious disruptions, it has a massive effect on the operation of our country.
Our transparency warrior and FOI king of Australia, Rex Patrick, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure.
Really wanted to have you on the program. At the moment, the work that you've been doing is becoming more relevant as the hours and the days go past. We have what seems to be a global crisis happening in the Middle East regarding the war in Iran, with the Straits of Hormuz closing and some other really alarming factors like some attacks on some oil installations. You've been doing some work on that exercise catalyst report that you worked on in 2019, correct me if I'm wrong. And I wanted to ask, how does that current war in Iran align with the simulated Middle East crisis that you predicted fuel imports would be dropping?
Yeah, look, I've done a lot of work since when I was in the Senate, and since leaving the Senate in and around fuel security. It's a massive problem for Australia, in my view. We currently have 25 days of diesel fuel in country, and we are supposed to have 90 days to meet an agreement we have with the International Energy Agency. We come from 2 decades ago having a significant capability in terms of production, and therefore the ability to basically keep the country running. But that has declined over the years, and I don't want to blame the Labor government. I don't want to blame the Liberal government. I'm going to blame both of them because both of them have neglected this area. We need to understand that uh, in Australia, a lot of our logistics are covered off by diesel, mostly by trucks. Anyone who goes for a drive in the country will see lots and lots of semi-trailers driving around with goods and so forth on board.
With a
We
sign that says, without trucks, Australia stops on the back of them, right?
Absolutely. And the NRMA did a study back around about 2015 that looked at what happens if you did have significant fuel disruptions. Food in Australia at our supermarkets, typically they have about 10 days of dry food, 7 days of fresh. We find that our chemists might have about 5 to 7 days of medicines. Our hospitals have about 3 days of medicine. So it's not just about whether or not you can go and pick up the kids in the car. If we do have serious disruptions, it has a massive effect on the operation of our country, and yeah, that's the huge problem we've got is that no one really has paid much attention to it. Look, one of the good things about this crisis is that I'm hoping further attention will be directed towards this national security and national resilience vulnerability that we have. In the last week or so, we've seen lots of people ramping up in Parliament talking about this, and it should have been talked about much sooner. So it is serious if we were to run out of fuel. I'm not suggesting that is happening, and I'm happy to run through what I think the status of our fuel supplies currently is, and what could happen. I might say that you mentioned I was seeking access to an exercise report related to fuel security. One of the things I did when I was in the Senate, and then subsequently as I left the Senate, I did ask for the government to release a liquid fuel security review that had been carried out, and some information on some of the exercises that had been carried out in relation to fuel security, and also what the um, emergency response manuals were. What should happen, or how do we know what will happen in the event of a disruption? Now, the government spent about $150,000 in lawyers resisting the disclosure of that information, but eventually, I'm a bit like a dog with a bone. I wouldn't let up, and the Administrative Review Tribunal ruled that it was in the public interest that the Australians get to see what this potential vulnerability is and how to solve it, and indeed what happens in circumstances as we have a crisis like we do right now.
We've missed you in the center, that's for sure, Rex. And like a dog with a bone, you've come across these, I suppose, like roadblocks put up. What is the deal with this bipartisan lapse around our energy security? I remember Corio refinery going down probably a decade now, and just such a big news in the area for that to be happening, and it sort of slipped through to the keeper in this just-in-time economy we thought was going to run forever. So what are the key policy oversights, you reckon, that have left us with only, 25, 26 days of fuel?
What's happened is over the decades, and you mentioned refinery shutting. Back in 2000 we had 8 refineries here in Australia, and then we saw them slowly shut, starting with Port Stanvac in South Australia, running through a whole range of other um, refineries shutting down, and that happened during the Howard government, then the Gillard government, then the Abbott government, then the Morrison government. So again, not any particular political party to blame here. We just saw the decrease in the number of refineries at the same time as our reserves were going down, as we went from a couple of 100 days to where we are now, 24 days of diesel fuel. So both things have been occurring. Now, there was some attention paid. So in 2014-15, the Senate did an inquiry looking into our particularly transport resilience, and mostly that focused on fuel resilience. Flowing from that, the government then did the liquid fuel security review that they then withheld from the public, and is now public because of efforts I've made in respect of getting access to those documents. And then, so that came out, I think, around about 2018, that liquid fuel security review. And no one had seen it. And then whilst I was in the Senate in 2021, the coalition passed a fuel security bill, which has now become the Fuel Security Act, and that did a number of things. One of them, or really the two dominant things it did, was firstly create a fuel services payment. At that point in time, we only had 2 refineries left, and they were saying, look, we can't operate, we can't compete with the scale of the operations in places like Singapore. And so the government stepped in and said, look, we recognise this is a national security issue. Um, just as we pay money for defence capability, for which there's little return until you really need it, the same with refineries. And so we have 2 refineries operating in Australia right now, and they are basically protected on the downside. So if they're making profits, we don't contribute. But if for some reason they start to make losses, the taxpayer steps in to protect them from the downside. So it was a reasonable balance. The second thing that happened in 2021 of the Fuel Security Bill was a minimum stock holding obligation was created for all of our refineries and distributors. Now, what they wanted to do was shift our fuel security requirements from the sort of 22 to 24 days we were having back then in terms of diesel up to 32 days. And so the government chipped in about $260 million to co-invest with the very agencies that they were imposing the obligation on, the stockholding obligation. And so what happened was uh, the Parliament passed those bills, and we have seen a number of projects kick up. And so it's interesting. I've been watching Chris Bowen talking about just some spin that's been taking place in the Parliament. Chris Bowen talking about firstly that we have 34 days of fuel. When probed by Barnaby Joyce, Chris Bowen had to admit that that included fuel on its way to Australia inside our economic exclusion zone. So immediately a crisis comes up and they jack up the numbers, where what we're normally used to reporting is what are called cover days, which basically relates to how much fuel's actually in this country under
Mm.
our sovereign control. The second thing that I've seen several ministers over the last 2 weeks saying in Parliament, we have more fuel now than we had for a decade. And that's true because we've shifted from 22 to 24 days up to 25. But they've sort of created this impression that everything's okay. We've got more fuel than we've ever had before. So it is the truth, but it's very misleading. And uh, they even claimed that they were the initiators of the minimum stockholding obligation, which is simply not true. That was legislated by the Morrison government. What did happen was when that bill was legislated in 2021, it took a while to develop the rules. They worked with industry to do that. Of course, you can't just impose an obligation without these companies having the ability to store. So they had to build these storage tanks with the funding I mentioned before. And then on the 1st of July 2023, where the Albanese government was in, that's when it kicked into play. So again, quite mischievous of the minister to suggest that that was their doing. Sure, it is true. It kicked in whilst they were in government, but it wasn't necessarily of their doing. And so we've got ministers in the Parliament telling stories that just, if anyone knows, just causes distrust. And I've had a bit of a crack at Chris Bowen here, so it's only fair that I then turn to the Liberal Party, who over the last couple of weeks have been having a crack at government because there are Bowsers that are running out of fuel. But if you look at it from a top level, you'll see that we have our 24 or 25 days of fuel, and since the crisis commenced, we have had continued supply coming to Australia, coming on shore by way of ship, being loaded into the relevant tanks and distributed. And the problem that we've got in terms of the Bowsers running dry is people either uh, buying more fuel than they need now because they're hedging against a price hike, or alternatively, they're panicking. And that panic is not helped by the Liberal Party doing what it's doing right now in the Parliament, which is basically saying there's shortages and there's mischief. The shortages are caused not by supply, but by an unusual increase in demand. So that's the real situation. Now, I don't say that there won't be a problem moving forward. If we see uh, the Straits of Hormuz shut for a period of time, we also know that, as you mentioned, there are some attacks that have taken place in relation to fuel infrastructure. That's not an easy fix. You can't just stop the war.
This is
And
also
so,
coming off some reports, Rex. An Iranian official just overnight said that oil will be going up to $200 a barrel. There are some reports too that there has been some, a small amount, but still some mining happening in the Straits of Hormuz there. So yeah, as you mentioned, this hasn't really kicked off from what you're saying, right? And the reverberations of this shock haven't quite hit the supply. Is that what you're kind of
yeah,
alluding
look,
to here?
I wouldn't be relying on an Iranian official. They're playing their own
Of
games.
course, of course.
And so you need to look at the cool, calm people, probably outside of politics, that can look at the statistics, look at the situation. If this conflict were to continue, there would be a problem. The other thing that's happened in the last 24 hours is the International Energy Agency has made a call for all these countries that have 90 days of fuel security. We do not have that. We are in essence, in some way, now bludging, to put it in Australian parlance, bludging off the hard work of some other countries. But the IEA has now instructed some of those fuel reserves around the world to be released, and that will help. that will help with meeting some of the demand. So
Rex, sorry to cut in, but we've seen over the last day, like if you watch the chart for oil, it's gone up and it's gone down and it's gone up and it's gone down again. Now, a lot of this feels like market manipulation if you look at it on a chart. And I suppose some of these sovereign reserves have been released, perhaps under the pressure of Washington. And, there is an artificial aspect to this supply coming in, right?
yeah, look, in terms of the volatility of the market, I think a lot of that is trading based on the last media release. People are looking, watching, is the situation getting worse? Oh no, we've seen President Trump say that it's going to be over soon. Then we see President Trump saying, well, we've got another 4 weeks to go. So there has been some volatility in the markets. So, but the world will react to this. So we're seeing the release of some reserves. We're also seeing we'll see that other countries will step up in terms of production. But I don't say that there's not a problem looming. I
Mm.
simply say where we are right now is not in an awful place. But just imagine if we had the 90 days of reserve that we are supposed to have. Because at this point in time, what would be happening is all Australians would be saying, I don't need to hoard. I don't need to panic here. And one of the things you can do with a reserve is release some of it in country, which is what would have happened, even if it were under instructions from the IEA, and that fuel gets released locally, so to ease the burden on shipping demand, but that helps drive prices down. So Australians are suffering from our lack of planning, or a lack of meeting our own obligations at this point in time, both in terms of the price of fuel and the fear that's been put into some people's mind about us rapidly running out of fuel. And that's, again, that is the problem of two governments, both Labor and Liberal, who have ignored this issue for a number of years. And the fact of the matter is, very much sexier standing in front of a fighter jet or a tank or a submarine and announcing defense policies than it is to stand in front of an oil tank and say, "Hey guys, we're spending money on these sorts of things." Defense has spent, the government has spent significant amounts of money. Look, if we think about our submarine force, for example, we saw us buying a French Barracuda class submarine. We spent about $4 billion not buying a submarine. Just translate that back into storage tanks, and you'd have probably 60 days just by if we hadn't wasted that money. We've spent over the last 2 or 3 years, we've committed and sent money of the order of $10 billion, $5 billion to the US for AUKUS, $5 billion to the UK for AUKUS. Now, in my view, we're not going to get those, certainly the US submarines. They simply won't be available, and the UK submarines will be years and years and years late.
Mm-hmm.
The UK submarine industry is one big cluster fiasco, and so we're directing money in an all eggs in one basket program for a submarine we may or may not get, for a hypothetical situation where Australia gets into some sort of conflict, either by choice supporting our allies or by necessity if it were an attack on Australian shores. But the point about fuel security is it doesn't take Australia to be involved in a conflict for us to be affected by fuel disruptions. And here we are now looking at that.
Well, you're saying that elbow standing in front of a tanker wouldn't look that sexy, but maybe in about 6 months' time, it could look like the sexiest thing in the world, right? I mean, that's the way things are going. And then this is an oil is gold scenario right now. And you mentioned reserves, and I just want to pivot to that American strategic reserve. Just like we've outsourced our sovereign defense, we're outsourcing our sovereign energy security as well. And we're sort of joined at the hip with this US sovereign fuel reserve. Can you explain a little bit more about that for us?
Yeah, so during COVID, people might remember that fuel prices actually went to negative, because no one was driving, no one was doing anything, and there were these huge amounts of oil that were being produced, and no one was using it. And at the time, Angus Taylor, who's now the opposition leader in Canberra, he was then the energy minister, bought I think it was about $97 million worth of fuel and put it in the US's strategic reserve. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that's 30 days away by ship. We should never have done that. Mind you, what happened to that strategic reserve? We don't have it anymore because when the Ukraine war started, remember I mentioned the IEA releasing fuel now. When the Ukraine war started, the IEA asked us to release that strategic reserve in the US, and we did. So we don't have it anymore.
Is there an IOU sitting somewhere in a box somewhere there, Rex? Or
No, well, I was going to say that the upside was that we sold it for double the price. So in terms of Angus Taylor and his investment strategy, well, but yeah, didn't solve the fuel security problem. It was the wrong thing, in my view, to put our fuel reserves in the US. It just doesn't make any sense. We need to have a sovereign controlled here in Australia reserve. And again, the reason we need this is because of the importance of diesel to our general living. And again, had we had 90 days, people wouldn't be panicking. People wouldn't be paying the high prices that they are now, and we wouldn't be worrying about what may happen down track because we would have a comfortable buffer.
but you feel that yeah, under 25 days right there, that people haven't been doing their work over decades. It seems like a bit of a pants down kind of scenario here, and yeah, anyone standing in front of a lectern talking about this right now looks like a bit of a goose. And you can see all the government sort of coming out in the front foot. I saw Chalmers, I've seen yeah, the whole senior cabinet essentially have a bit of a ramble about it. And there are some, alarming things here. I mean, we talk about our fuel or our submarines or, our security being owned, or, we need to seek permission to get access to by or through Washington. We're seeing right now in South Korea, there's a bit of an issue here where their whole air defense networks being kind of decommissioned and moved across to the Gulf. And I want to ask you too, I mean, like, if we do get another sovereign reserve, is it going to be in the United States again? Or are there talks now to onshore it, in light of all these other things that are happening as well? Or is this just going to be another make the same mistake twice scenario?
Look, I think it has to be onshore. Whenever you've heard the saying, possession is 9/10 of the law. It turns out that if we have ships at sea, if they're flagged as they typically are under Panama flags, Panama, their government can requisition under their laws those ships. Actually, I won't say that I know that for sure, but for example, if there's an Australian flag ship under the Defence Act, where it's necessary, we can take control of it. One would presume Panama has done the same thing. So just because it's on a ship heading towards Australia does not mean that we will get the fuel. So look, there are other pressures that push back on this. So, there are regular distributors who sell this fuel to Australia, and they'll be worried a little bit about their reputation as well. So they're probably not going to sell it to a higher bidder once they've committed to delivering it. But there's nothing as sure as having the fuel on your own soil, which you have complete control over. So, again, that's a lesson that hopefully is in the forefront of everyone's mind at this point in time.
And Rex, in an island girt by sea, an island continent at the bottom of the earth and at the end of global supply chains, how important is that just alone? I mean, that geographical factor.
Well, again, we have to have our fuel arrive to us via ocean. It's a big ocean, and there are lots of things that can get in the way, as we've seen. And the last thing we would, one of the things we might be fortunate about was that we didn't have a heavy fire season. So there's more fuel than perhaps we might otherwise have had there been a significant fire season. We could have some sort of disruption out of Singapore or Japan. And I might just make the point, because I'll just clear up with your viewers that there are people that have been suggesting, well, our fuel comes from Singapore and it comes from Japan. You just have to be aware that is refined fuel, and the crude comes largely from the Middle East. Okay,
Mm.
so we've got to be careful about people just dismissing the fact that, well, we get our fuel from refineries in Singapore and Korea.
And Rex, sorry, on those refineries upstream there, I saw each of those countries you mentioned, including South Korea as well, and Australia's in that mix, have suffered some of the biggest stock, crashes over the last week or so, and it's exposing the vulnerability of these oilless Asian island states, right? What could be the risk that Singapore or Japan all of a sudden disappear on some of these consignments, or just have a massive policy shift if this thing continues?
Well, one of the things that is up our sleeves is the fact that we supply both Singapore and Japan with gas. So they probably won't look to us and say, we're not going to supply the Australians, because they'd be cutting their nose off in spite of their face.
Yeah,
So there's one advantage that does work in our favour. But for other countries, that might not be the case.
yeah.
So there's a bit of a partnership that's happening in relation to that, or if you like, a bit of a strategic counterweight, because LNG for Japan and Singapore and South Korea all comes from, or mostly comes from Australia.
Now, just before we move on the LNG there, Australia being such a massive supplier, and I saw in Qatar one of the biggest installations there was destroyed. Uh, what's the what's the scenario with gas? I mean, is it linked to this at all? Is there a need for a sovereign gas reserve? And also, is there going to be a huge benefit for these multinational gas companies in the period ahead that once again comes at the expense of Australians?
Yeah, look, maybe I'll put the solution on the table first. We should have a gas reservation policy that is retrospective. You might recall in December, the Albanese government announced a prospective gas reservation policy, which means all new gas, some of it has to be diverted to Australia. But the problem with that is that right now, we might get 15% of zero, because there is no new gas. What we should have done was had a retrospective policy, which meant all of the gas that's being exported now, some of it would stay here in Australia. We do have the Australian Domestic Gas Security Mechanism. I know that because I was the person that negotiated that on behalf of Senator Xenophon back in 2017. That trigger exists because of the efforts of Nick Xenophon and myself. That allows the government to ultimately say we're not exporting because we've run out. But let's just say we run the normal course. Qatar is no longer exporting the LNG that it was, and as a result, they are on par with us in terms of exports. That's a huge drop in supply around the world. Now, what will happen is Australia will step up and say, we're happy to export more. Now, when they do that, it's going to drive the international price up, and it's also going to drive up the local price, because that's what we've seen. Whenever there's been shortages, these gas companies they tend to their highly profitable international customers. That saps gas from the local market, and whenever you reduce supply, the price then rises. And the problem with that is that because everyone will be sitting there going, well, I don't use gas. Some of our big industries do, but gas also sets the electricity price. So we are, just as we've watched our fuel prices go up, and that was easily predictable by most people. Most people haven't clicked onto the idea that their electricity prices are about to go up as well.
Totally.
So we get hit with a double whammy: that your fuel costs, any goods and services that are transported by diesel trucks, which is most of it, will go up in price, and our electricity is going to go up in price, and that will in turn drive inflation up. And so all those people that are struggling as a result of those rising prices are then going to get hit with an interest rate rise. So none of this is good.
Yeah, this this seems like a bit of a a confluence of shit here that's about to hit the Australian market, and people have been comparing it to the '70s crisis here, but there are some other factors at play here that could turn it into a unique crisis in its own right. I wanted to talk about these multinationals that seem to have sway over our entire energy industry in Australia, many of whom don't pay tax. And with massive companies like BP and Exxon dominating imports, yeah, how does all this foreign ownership further expose Australia to this redirection of supplies during the war?
Well, one of the problems we have, particularly in relation to gas, is that foreign entities can do what's called transfer pricing. So they basically raise the prices internally in Australia so that there's little profit, and then have much cheaper operations running overseas in the low tax jurisdictions.
Mm.
We've got a first issue in that some of these companies are not paying a lot of income tax, but they're also not paying any petroleum resource rent tax either. So in effect, we end up giving away this finite resource. So every time there's a crisis like this, the gas cartel, they smile. They're going to laugh all the way to the bank here, whilst Australians suffer. And that's one of the problems I think we had with the prospective gas policy that the government announced in December, is that it put Australians in third place. I would say that there was significant pressure from Japan in particular, but the other two Asian receivers of our LNG, which is Singapore and South Korea, to not have a reservation policy. Huge pressure. And I know, because I've been fighting in the Administrative Review Tribunal for documents relating to gas reservation policies, with DFAT arguing that those countries will get very upset, even if policy thoughts were released. So first, in some in some sense, what we say here is that the prospective gas reservation policy served the citizens and the industries of Japan first. Then it served the cartel, who get higher prices and make money out of the export. And then third in place were us Australians, who own the resource. And to me, that's just wrong. Now, I will tell you, today in the Senate, the One Nation they've introduced a bill on a gas reservation policy. Uh, they weren't allowed to debate it. They didn't then have a general debate on gas reservation policy. Now, look, I'm not a big supporter of One Nation. I know Pauline quite well. I know Malcolm Roberts quite well. Um, Look, I just don't like all of their politics, but it's not hard to see why everyday Aussies look and go, "Yeah, I want that," because that's putting Australians first. And I just hope maybe some of this puts pressure on the government to actually stand up and do the right thing for Australians, rather than putting others first.
Yeah, you're right there. And I mean, Clive Palmer's back in the game running on the same thing as well, taxing the gas giants. And, who would have thought? It's like we're in La La land, topsy turvy land here. And it really highlights one thing in Canberra, that the bipartisan blob, their friendships are so nuanced and defined with the people in these industries that they just can't fathom this future, this sovereign future. And they're leaving this low-hanging fruit to people like Pauline Hanson and all that to get in. I mean, this should be in the heartland of Labor's core key strategies right now moving forward.
Absolutely, and people like the Australian Workers Union, Australian Metal Workers Union, big sort of parts of the Labor organisation have been trying to push for this. But there's nothing like Minister turning up in Japan as a hero. Um, you know, um, I can't explain it. Again, when I was in the Senate, I tried to push hard on a gas reservation policy. You can see, one of the things that I did was get an Australian gas domestic gas security mechanism put in place. Part of the reason for that was that back in 2017, we had people coming to us in South Australia, to Nick Xenophon and I, saying, hey, it's not that the price is too high, we can't even get an offer. What had happened was, that was around the time 2015 through 17, the gas trains turned on in Gladstone, and that's when all of our exports started. And the gas companies here in Australia, had banked on a bunch of reserves that they were tapping into that didn't end up delivering as they thought. And they had contracts to give gas, or to send gas overseas. And so what did they do? They stripped gas from the Australian market. And that's what brought about that particular domestic security mechanism. But at the same time, I actually did some negotiations with the government about a gas reservation scheme. At the time, all they could do was look to a perspective, and I thought, well, that's better than nothing, but it's not the right solution. And look, one of the reasons I like having disparate people in the parliament, um, people used to ask me about some people. I won't mention who they are, but they'd say, "What about X being in the parliament?" And I'd say, "Look, there's a certain percentage of the Australian population that are crazy, and they need their representative too." That's how democracy works. But you've got good people. Jackie Lambie pressing for gas reservation. David Pocock standing up today and pressing for gas reservation. But I don't really want to venture into politics here, but I can just give you my experience as a senator. When the bells rang, I would sometimes walk into the Senate chamber and I'd sit next to someone from Labor or Liberal, bearing in mind I was independent. So sometimes I voted with the Liberals, sometimes I voted with Labor. But I'd sometimes say to them, "Hey, what are we voting on?" Now, of course, I knew, but I took some pleasure in asking the question, because a lot of the times they'd just say, "Well, I don't know, Rex." They would just walk into the chamber, look to see where their whip was sitting. The whip being the person who organises what happens in the chamber for votes. And if the whip was sitting on the yes side, they'd go and sit on the yes side. And the whip was sitting on the no side, they'd go and sit on the no side. Now that's someone who's representing a party, not their constituents. Whereas all of the independents, they were in there and voting in accordance with their constituent needs and their conscience. There was never a vote in the Senate where if someone rang my office and said, "Rex, why did you vote that way?" where I couldn't explain it. That's just the general problem you have with our party system, is that there are only a small number of people, particularly ministers and shadow ministers, who really do get to make all of the decisions. And you'll find sometimes you'll have a member of parliament who says, "Look, I'm sympathetic towards you, but I can't change it."
Hello, everyone. If you're enjoying this episode and all the others we've had like it, please like and subscribe. I can't tell you enough how important it is to our channel that you just hit that little button down there and a thumbs up, and let that algorithm know that you want to see more of this program. If you're feeling adventurous, head to www.boganintel.com, where you can sign up for a measly $5 a month and read articles and get podcasts on a regular basis. So thank you so much. Back to the program. And gone are those memories, I used to hear memories of the argy-bargy at those, labor conferences. You'd have these Trotskyite backbenchers getting up and yelling in the background and, saying all sorts of random shit. And look, you don't have to like them. You don't have to hate them on both sides. But yeah, having those, the crows that fly left of the murder, or the nails that stick up in the floorboard, like yourself, Rex, for a little bit. It's such an important part of the Australian political landscape. And it almost feels like this new cohort in Canberra have actually forgotten what the whole bloody job's all about to begin with, right? I mean, was that your experience to some extent?
It's particularly the case where you've got a huge majority in the House of Reps that is with the one party. And But even the Liberal Party are the same. The Greens are the same. They have a different political leaning, but to get a decision made, they go to the party room, and that's how their decision making works. I'll tell you a story, and I'll say this: Jim Molan, who sadly passed, he was an ex Army general turned senator. And I remember going into Senate estimates one day, and he really started to pull defence apart. And he was obviously very equipped to do that, having been a general. And um, I saw him a few days later. I said, "Mate, I enjoyed that little session that you had querying defence." And he said, "Well, unfortunately, Rex, I've been tapped on the shoulder and told that if I do that sort of stuff, because he was in government, or his party was in government, if you do that sort of stuff, you might not get pre-selected." And then that was the end of his ability to go outside the guardrails.
After all he'd bloody done for the party, and there he is. It feels like there's so many checked. I mean, off the top of my head, Ed Husick sort of sticks out like a fair bit in that camp at the moment, and Fatima Payman before him, who they went one step further.
If you look at Ed Husick, look, good on him. He came out just recently talking about gas reservation policies, and he was very strong. But he was the minister at one stage, and he was trapped in the solidarity and collective responsibility of cabinet, and clearly couldn't say what he really wanted to say. And that's just one of the unfortunate things about the party system. So we need to. I like independence because they actually truly represent people, and they can go and have these sorts of fights. And again, you look across the crossbench, and you'll see people who are sticking up saying, "Let's look at gas reservation." It's funny. I know a week before the Iranian conflict started, I looked on the notice paper because I'm a bit of a nerd. You said I might be a nail sticking up from the floorboard, or I used to be. I'd like to think I still am. Okay, I like to think I'm a bit of a troublemaker, public interest troublemaker. But
you're more of a big rake in the bloody floor these days.
Yeah, sure.
Rex just smacks him in the head, I reckon.
Well, I'll come back to that, but I do note that Jackie Lambie put some questions on notice in relation to fuel security. So she's clearly thinking about these things, and that was before the Iranian conflict. But just in general, on my public interest troublemaking, I've been fighting just recently on the Freedom of Information bill, and back in December, Albanese had a crack at me at question time, and the media contacted me and said, "Oh, Albo's had a crack at you. Clearly doesn't like what you're doing." And to which I said, "Well, if Mr. Albanese doesn't like what I'm doing, he can get to the back of a very long line, and there will be no queue jumping just because he is the Prime Minister." And look, if you are someone who's a public interest troublemaker, you are judged by the enemies you make. Luckily, we live in a country where I don't have to look behind my back because I'm upsetting people in politics, and that is a nice thing about Australia. But judge people by but judge your success by the enemies that you're making.
And you have made a few, but you've also sort of paved a bit of a way ahead here. I mean, what stands out now, as the masses in Australia are becoming much more politically engaged due to a whole bunch of reasons that keep pulling them away from the people like you really stand out, people like Pocock, people like Lambie. And even if you're from the other side of the aisle, someone who's independent and speaks independently and represents their constituents are quite irresistible to the public, I think, at the moment. And, we saw something with the teal movement in 22, but I think that was kind of a compartmentalized movement. And we are going to be looking at a much more broader spread in this country, I think. And people like you have kind of led the way. Before I did want to ask you a little bit about, independent future and things like that. And I might close on that, but I wanted to just ask you a couple more questions about this sovereignty issue, because that's really what it is. It's It's another sovereignty issue when it comes down to it. And as a transparency advocate who works on these issues, how do you feel that the fuel vulnerabilities compromise our sovereignty? And particularly around forcing concessions or foreign policy or in our alliances like AUKUS and how we have a say in how we conduct ourselves within them.
Yeah, look, I think any time that you are dependent on someone else, you have to pay something for that dependency. No such thing as a free lunch, and uh, that's just the way it is. Look, I would like to think we are a rich country. We have a lot of resources. Unfortunately, we are squandering those resources. We're not collecting money for the material that we export, and in actual fact, we should not be exporting. We should be manufacturing stuff here. Stop exporting iron ore. Let's export steel. Stop exporting lithium. Let's export batteries. That sort of thing. And so we're sort of squandering that opportunity. We could have a very strong economy. And my view, I'm a former member of the Australian Defence Force, a former submariner. So I'm pro defence. I think you have to have the insurance policy that defence is, but rather than having a defence force that consists of 12 nuclear powered submarines, or sorry, eight nuclear powered submarines that have come at great cost. It forces a dependency on the US and the UK, but it also denies us the ability to buy other things that we would like to have, like fuel security, like investment in industry resilience, like investment in munitions, things that when you go to war are used and go, and you have to replace. And the Ukraine has taught us something about that. Being able to make our own munitions, things like drones, where warfare has changed, and yet we're investing in a huge monolithic capability. We need to have a defence force that is flexible, highly capable, and able to operate independently. We should focus first and foremost on defence of Australia, and then look at how we might help places like New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia to our north, Timor-Leste, and then from there, how might we help our allies? We shouldn't be structuring our defence force such that it becomes part of the Seventh Fleet. We should be structuring the Defence Force for defence of Australia and then working out how that particular force might fit into our operations with our allies. And that is simply not happening. And in my view, that's just another example. In fact, it's part of the same problem we've got here with fuel security, is that we are just not focusing on being independent and sovereign, but able to then work in with partners for collective good when we need to.
And that's such a key point you make there. We're not focused on being independent and sovereign, so much so that we're not even looking after something as vital, as nationally vital in a country that stops without trucks as a sovereign fuel reserve. We've become so used to outsourcing so many factors of our sovereign capability to the United States mostly,
Yeah.
that our politicians have been so politically focused at the extent of actually thinking in the sovereign imagination, right?
I'll give you a really good example of this. So Australia has invested $1 billion in a US company. I'll just keep the names out of it for the moment. In terms of quantum computing.
Hmm.
Now we've sent $1 billion to the US at the expense of and instead of giving it to our own industry to do. We could have had $1 billion worth of sovereign capability being developed. Instead, what we've done is given a leg up to the United States, who will compete with us.
That's right.
Just
We gave
crazy,
we gave
crazy stuff.
Microsoft that government cloud contract, and now the bloke who runs the company is embroiled in one of the biggest scandals in modern history. It would be great if we could think about onshoring and onboarding some of these things, even just things like value adding. For every ton of ore, we have to produce a certain amount of steel, just something like that. I mean, we saw Indonesia with a green nickel project that it organized with China. It was a win-win for both sides. And as a consequence, WA nickel industry's gone under, essentially, right?
You've got to start thinking about them. I mean, there are people I call the free trade Taliban in Canberra that absolutely just hardliners. There shall be no protections, but they don't look to see actually what's happening in places like China and the US, where there is considerable protection. There's considerable assistance from the United States government and the Chinese government, and we don't compete on an even playing field. So we pay people properly. We pay superannuation. We have healthcare, and that does cost something.
Mm-hmm.
And then we looked and say, well, let's get it from China, where none of that occurred. And it ends up being a false economy. We've got to really sort of think the way that we're going to be thinking differently. A lot of people say, again, in relation to our fuel, well, that's a cost that we have to pay. Well, it's only a small cost compared to what happens when the country stops working. And even I'm not one necessarily for giving grants to Australian industries. I think we should take equity stakes, and the government is starting to do some of that, where they hand over their money and say we now own part of the company.
Makes
Um,
sense.
that I saw Singapore did that. They would always hand over money, and what they'd say is, okay, Joel, you want to be a really good company in the space of X. We'll invest in your company and we'll come back to you in 5 years' time, and we're going to buy you out at an agreed price. And if
Look
the
at
company,
Singapore.
and if the company's not doing well, actually the company suffers because they have to buy back at the price. And if they do extremely well, the company, in some sense, does even better because whilst the government makes money on it, the company goes, well, I've actually bought back these shares at a price that's less than what I would otherwise have had to pay. That's smart thinking coming from the Singaporeans and the way they do business. And so we do need to change some of the stuff we do, but we also need to recognise. So, for example, steel in Whyalla. We should invest in steel and Whyalla. Alongside that, we should be encouraging the use of Australian steel in all government-funded projects and making sure that the steel, even if it comes from China, must meet Australian standards. Then that is not discriminatory, but it drives the Chinese to produce different steel that may be more costly, and that then has to compete on more even terms with Australian steel. But we need to have structural steel. If you can't make steel, well, give up making stuff. And sometimes that takes an investment by the taxpayer because it's not always just about private interest. There's an element of national interest involved in that. And so maybe the taxpayer has to put some money in and again, do it in a way that if the company's successful, we profit from it.
Yeah, agreed. And look, the Albanese government just saw the potential in Whyalla a little bit there, but you often wonder if it's about shoring up a supply of steel for all the American projects that are going to be happening here. And I saw something out happening over in Esperance around there with an Alcoa plant and some complete and utter, destruction of Jarrah forest nearby, just granted there by the Environment Minister. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on to speak about this. Before I let you go, though, I can't have a transparency warrior / submariner in the room without asking you for your thoughts on 3 Australian service people being involved in the torpedoing of the IRIS Dina.
Yeah, that's right. Look, firstly, there's a couple of elements to that. I'll just explain them. Some people have said, "Hey, that warship was on a visit to India and Sri Lanka, and should not have been attacked. Under international law, the laws of conflict, If you go to war with Iran and you see an Iranian warship, you are entitled to sink it. And there's no war crime involved in that. And you don't have to pick up the phone and say to the captain of the ship, I'm about to torpedo you. Surprise is an accepted practice in warfare. Just as the fighter pilot flying over Tehran doesn't have to ring up and say, I'm about to bomb you, neither does the submarine captain. So there was certainly no breach in international law by conducting a surprise attack. Then, in relation to the picking up of survivors, there is a requirement to make sure people don't suffer, including people in military uniforms. But actually, for a long time, submarines have not done that, mostly because submarines are not well suited to taking all sorts of people on board, and they don't really have medical facilities. And if you have Sri Lankan vessels and other vessels nearby that can give effect to a rescue, then it's probably actually the better thing to happen rather than surfacing on a submarine and trying to take care of sailors in a vessel that is totally unsuited to that. So I'll just
Rex,
say,
just to add a query there. So, it's perfectly legal within the laws of the sea there, and rules of engagement. But I do want to ask you, it is the first significant event like this since World War II, with this kind of
well,
vessel going down. So, I mean, there is something significant that happened there. So, I mean, there has been restraint used in the past. I mean, do you think that, potentially this might just highlight the diverging values in the Australian and the US defense forces at the moment, or?
well, I'm going to put some facts on the table here. So back in 1971, I think that's right, a Pakistani submarine named Hangor sunk an Indian frigate in the Indo-Paki War. You might also remember back in 1982, the HMS Conqueror sunk the General Belgrano as well. And there's also been a torpedo attack by a North Korean submarine on a South Korean frigate about 10 years ago. So it doesn't happen very often, but it's not necessarily unusual. And indeed, you would not wait if you've got an opportunity to sink a vessel. You wouldn't wait for it to get close to the area of operation. There's no requirement for you to do that. So it gets a bit trickier if it's a merchant vessel and it's flagged Iranian. There's something called restricted and unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Germans adopted unrestricted submarine warfare where they just sank merchant vessels.
Yep.
And there are some questions about that in international law. So it's not necessarily unusual. Why would we treat that kind of operation differently to the use of bunker busters or something else?
Yep.
That is just warfare, and as long as the commander was satisfied. A lot of people are saying, look, this war is illegal. And look, I tend to agree. We have a rules-based order where we say no one gets to attack another country just because they don't like what they're doing. We would normally, as happened in other past wars, you at least get a United Nations mandate to do that so that there's some general consensus around that. But just because those decisions about being at war are matters for people like Donald Trump, not the submarine captain. The submarine captain is subject to national law, and if he gets an order to sink an Iranian war vessel, he will follow that order because it's a lawful command, and he's not responsible for sending the country to war. He's responsible to his commander-in-chief for following orders. Now, that doesn't mean that if he was ordered to sink a refugee vessel, that at that point in his thinking, he would have to say to himself, that's probably not a lawful command. That probably is a war crime. There are, commanders are held responsible for war crimes, just as a soldier might be held responsible for a war crime, walking into a school and shooting children.
And are attached Australian personnel also assigned to that responsibility under that commander?
I don't know what the arrangements have been. I can criticise Albanese in respect of this, but the you'll have Australian sailors that are cross-decking. They're on board another submarine, and they will be responsible for carrying out their job. Now, it depends on what their job is. They could be the chef
Hmm.
cooking meals for the 120 crew, or they could be someone operating the reactor, which is highly likely, noting that we're trying to build some experience in respect of AUKUS, or they could have been a sonar operator tracking the ship, or they, potentially could have been a weapons control officer hitting the fire button. Now, I don't differentiate any of those people from the conduct of what happened on that submarine. In terms of, the Prime Minister said, well, they weren't involved in an offensive action. If that was a joyous occasion nationally, because it turned the war, everyone would look at that crew and say, what a great team. It's a team effort. And so Albanese standing up and saying that our people didn't press the fire button is actually not how it works. And
Yeah.
what should have happened, in my view, is, and I don't know who's to blame here. Maybe there's an FOI and I need to do, but the Navy should have advised the government that there were people on board submarines that were going into an operational area where a situation might arise, such as what happened
Should
with.
they have not been there, Rex?
Well, my view
According to
is,
you?
in my view, AUKUS is at least a decade away from delivery. What should have happened in this circumstance is to remove any issues. They should have said, we need to take our people off the submarine, and they can come back and do their training and their cross-decking at some later stage. I think it's
Yep.
really quite disingenuous to stand there and say, well, our people weren't firing didn't hit they didn't turn the safe fire key and hit the fire button. They were part of a team, and without the full team, that submarine would be ineffective in what it does.
So the whole sending them to bed without their supper and no tally isn't a good excuse either, right?
No, I don't think so. Again, what should have happened is the government should have received advice from the Navy, and then the Navy should have been told to get to Vertrep or to by way of boat get our personnel off any vessel that was likely to be involved in a conflict to which we don't want to be a direct party.
They would have had time to. They knew that vessel was in situ, where it was, how, what was happening before and after the event.
Well,
So yeah, it's, there's,
the way this would have worked, and
they
this is
were
a lot.
waiting, but sorry, Rex, they were waiting in the water for it. They had their pants down. They were coming back from a bloody neutral military exercise, and they were. I mean, it was a bit. Isn't it a bit of a dog's move in the submarine world to do something like that? It's not a very. I know you guys are a bit wily, you submariners, and you have your own rules of the sea, but
The rule is do not shoot machine gun the survivors. That's
that's all you've got. Everything else is open.
Yeah, look. I've got to say,
I've seen dust boot. I know what you guys are like.
Our submariners are really professional. So that's the good news here. But we had sailors on board that were properly instructed to be on board, and they are there doing a particular duty. In some sense, we put them in a situation that they should not have been put in. That submarine, the way it works, is that submarine would have been tasked. There would have been some intelligence that said, this vessel is down off Sri Lanka, and they would have said to the submarine captain, you need to get your submarine there, down to 200 meters, crank her up to 200 knots, to 30 knots, and get down there, and you'll get some further instructions. At that point, there should have been a query raised about, well, we've got Australians on board and there's a protocol in place, as the Prime Minister said. At that point, we should have arranged for a boat transfer or in some way, or a helicopter transfer to get them off the submarine, and that could have happened. So it's not as though they would have just been bimbling around Sri Lanka. They would have been tasked to go there.
Right.
we do not blame our sailors for following lawful commands and doing as they are told to do in uniform. We have very strict. The High Court has dealt with this in a case back in the 20s, where uniformed personnel are required to obey not any order but any lawful order, and provided they felt they weren't breaching a lawful order, then actually they just did their job. And look, I thank all our servicemen and women for putting themselves in harm's way. I just don't think Minister Albanese should have left them on the submarine. I think that's a failing of the Navy and or the government.
Thank you very much for that. It's a very unique and it's a skill set that not everyone has, Rex. So I'm sorry for throwing that one at you, but I really appreciate it. And I would love to have you on for an AUKUS submarine themed episode in the future. I still pull out that little matrix that you made up for Michael West out of my wallet and show it to people from time to time that broke down the prices of AUKUS and just how it can be applied to so many amazing sovereign defense capabilities. So thank you so much for coming on, Rex, and a pleasure to finally meet you. And good luck with all the work you're doing. Keep jamming out those FOIs. And just before you go, is there a political run in you again, or are you done? Just the FOI grey nomad?
Okay. Look, well, actually, I'll just say I'm not a grey nomad in the context. As you know, I am working from a caravan. People can see the
work from Rome. Sorry, work from Rome. Yeah,
work from Rome. I consciously, I'm not on holidays. I'm consciously just decided I want to have a different office view every week. So I'm working hard. Look, it's probably I'm in some sense semi-retired, but in terms of going back into politics, back in 2025, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party stitched up electoral laws such that it is actually impossible for an independent to have a fair crack. Now, being the person that I am not currently a plaintiff in the High Court with Zoe Daniel, a former Teal, challenging those laws constitutionally. So that's my little bit.
Legend.
What I will say to you is that I do have standing in the fight, but I've advised my lawyers that I've given some consideration to running, but I can't under these new laws. So I have to get those overturned first before I turn my mind back to whether or not I would run.
I think there's a lot of people that are hoping you and Zoe do get some good results there. Personally, I want to back an independent candidate somewhere where I live, and I think a lot of people do. So, yeah, let's hope.
It's not about me, and it's not about Zoe. It's about making sure that you guys get choices at elections.
Love it very much, Rex. You're a legend, and wherever you roam, you've got a lot of fans out there. Thank you very much for joining our program.
All right, I'm back to doing an FOI submission now.
Make sure you check out some of that scenery too, all right? It looks beautiful. Take care.
Good on you.
See you, Rex.